and here I can see that Groovy isn't actually a very complex thing. It has a public interface that just is providing a public-private encapsulation of the implementation space inside. And this pattern, when you see it, is it just basically means that the module has declared this some private endpoints inside here, and by declaring them private, they're automatically wrapped inside a filtering gateway, the private filter endpoint. We can see though that there's a Groovy runtime, etc., etc. And again, we can click on and we can see references to the space details, and that takes us back the full circle to where we came from. Okay, so returning back to my demo, the test module I can go and look at the module details for this, and we see that it comprises one address space, the outer address space, which has got an identifier of this. This is the public address space, and we see there's also a mapped address space inside there. You see it's slightly indented, that shows that it's an internal address space for this module. So what if I want to take my service, let's look at the space details here, and we see that I've got my example service here in the module. That was created for us automatically by the tool. We can go and look at that. We can see that the interface for that has a grammar of res test module / service anything can come after that. So basically that's a sort of classical REST interface to this service. Now we're familiar with how NetKernel allows you to introduce sort of architectural components irrespective of the details of the implementation code. So what if I wanted to look at this space and wrap this endpoint, this service, with a throughput throttle that ensured that it never received more than 2 concurrent requests? So I need an example of another throttle. I know there's a component. I've heard of this idea of a throttle. I don't know the details of how to implement it, and I'm not sure what it's going to do when I apply it. So let's go back out to the top of the Explorer and do a search. And this is a live dynamic search across all of the system metadata. So let's find what it can tell us about throttle. And we see that there's a throttle endpoint here, or prototype in layer 1. And we can see that there are quite a few different modules that are using throttles or called throttle. So let's look at this prototype, see what that means. Again, we get the metadata description of the endpoint telling us its configuration parameters, how to import it. I'm going to copy and paste that because I actually will want to use this tool. And I can see the details of how this tool works with its documentation in line. Okay, that's fine, but I want to see an example of its use rather than the prototype itself. So I won't click on prototype details, but I'll click on instances of this prototype. Where's this component being used in other parts of the system? And I can see that currently it's being used in an NKP server, it's being used in an SSH fulcrum, and it's being used in a web front-end fulcrum. So that sounds like one I might be interested in. I'm going to look at the front-end fulcrum. So I want to look at the space details. Actually, I don't want to look at the space details. I don't care too much about the internals. What I want to do is look at the module details. And I can see there's a front-end fulcrum here. And so now I want to actually look at the module XML for this, so I can see the details of how the throttle is being used. And we see here there's a declaration of an overlay, and it's a throttle overlay with a configuration. So I'm going to grab that now, take that as my working piece of code that I think is going to apply a throttle, and I'm going to introduce it into my demo space. So there's my throttle, and I'm going to call it name throttled with a concurrency of 2 and a queue of, let's just say, 100 requests. So let's change the concurrency to 2. Let's change the queue to 100. So there's my space. This is the internals that it's going to wrap. So I'm going to need to put that in a little bit, and I need to finish that space off and finish the overlay off. So the overlay is now wrapping that mapper. So I'm going to save that now. And what I'll find, if I go back to the Explorer tool, is that there's errors reported in my system. You see the NetKernel continuous monitoring has told me there's errors. So what's the problem? And we can see that the tool is telling me that there's an unresolved prototype, and the name of the prototype is throttle. The problem's occurring in my test module, and the throttle cannot be resolved. So I can go and look at that module, the module details. I can see that this space is failing to be resolved, and I can see that there's an unresolved prototype in that space. So I can go back to my code and I can realize, what I've not done is I've not imported layer 1, which is going to provide me with that throttle endpoint. So I need to import URI NetKernel next layer 1. So that import should now provide me with the prototype that I need to instantiate a throttle in my address space. If I now refresh this view, I see that that throttle is now instantiated here. I can look at the actual throttle itself in detail. I can see the throttle is now active around the address space. I can see it's got it's so far not admitted any requests, and there's no queue on there. So this is the live data from that particular throttle in the system. So let me go back and look at that in the space view. So I don't need to navigate back to that link. I can go and straight away look at my test module in the diagram. And what we now see is the diagram's changed somewhat. Let's put the libraries back on so it's the same view as we saw last time. What we can see is I've got my public space here as it was before, and we now see that there's now a throttle being introduced between the mapper and the map space that contains the implementation of my services. So this throttle is providing a guaranteed load shaping bridge between this space and this space, where there can be only a maximum 2 concurrent requests going into this space.